Hi, Hoji. Thanks for joining me, friend.
Hello.
So I'm hoping that we can talk about Bio-Emotive, which I love and use all the time, and also WeSpaces, which you introduced me to, and I've been very interested in of late. And yeah, I think there's a lot for us to discuss. And maybe just to start, if you would be willing to talk about yourself and your life story and your background. Love to hear about people and where they're coming from. And I find it really frames a lot of the context for the conversations that we end up having. You can share whatever you'd like about your life at whatever length. Any way that you'd like to share about yourself is welcome and appreciated.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. So my name is Hoji Alexandra. I work as a biomotive coach right now and facilitator of different group processes. And looking at how I would describe my life, it's kind of two trajectories, the spiritual path and then just making my way through life path. Grew up in a small town, which as I've gotten older is actually very relevant to how I see and approach the world. My mother's an expressive therapist. My father's a psychologist. Both of them have a really deep meditation practice. I worked in foster care in my early 20s. Got burnt out doing that. Ended up having a little bit of an acting career, modeling career, alongside running a big, massive, crazy art space. So that was very interesting and fun time of my life. I managed 48 studio spaces and 2 art galleries and a music venue and a workshop, put together community gardens for the neighborhood, a lot of newcomers in the area. And that was kind of the beginning of me starting to be like, hey, I can play in this world. Like things that seem impossible might not be impossible. Mm-hmm. That ended up closing down about 5-6 years later. And I moved to Vancouver, which was kind of my first time getting away from the small city life or small town life. And that was in my late 20s. And that was the beginning of me starting on this entrepreneurial kind of reality, which was, oh, how do I make my way in the world and pay for my bills and think about the future and not just be kind of this like coasting artist all the time. So that was when I got involved working with my father, also my mother, helping them kind of put them on the map a little bit, the best that I could. My dad, as we know, is a psychologist. And one of the things that we were dealing with was, how do we get your work like it's really helpful for people? How do we get it out of one-on-one therapy and into the hands of more people? So that is where I started kind of conceptualizing, like, how do I translate this to a repeatable model or method for people? So I did that for a few years, and then I had my daughter, and she's now about just under 2 years old. And that was kind of like the next transition where I went, I'm going to have to actually start settling into certain identities. And as someone who's been a meditation practitioner for so many years, like when I led my acting life and my art career life, I literally did not plan ahead 2 weeks. Like, you could have asked me to book this and I would have said, sure, but I might get an audition and I'll have to say no.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
right? Like, so 2 weeks, that was the most I would ever plan. So that's been fun. And now here we are. So now I've settled into kind of more of my role. I'm doing coaching work. I do facilitation work. I spent a lot of time circling and working just in communication practices. And that's kind of the space that I'm hanging out in right now.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Oh, I love that overview of your life, friend, because we met at sort of a specific chapter of both of our lives, and you know, meeting you really touched me. I learned a lot from your example and from your friendship, and even though it's been some time since we spoke, you really have stayed with me. And also, it's like when you meet someone like that, when you sort of like cross paths, you don't know everything about them, and it's lovely to hear more about your life and kind of get a fuller view. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
I'd be curious to hear just, you mentioned as an aside that growing up in a small town kind of shaped how you see things, and that you've maybe been reflecting on that recently. And I grew up in sort of a pretty large town, so I don't really know what that's like, and I'd be curious to hear some of those reflections, how that's shaped your life and the way you see the world and participate in it.
yeah. I appreciate that question. It's also like a very deeply personal question.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Fair.
and it's a great question. I guess you're just kind of accustomed to the waters that you swim in. And so I started to expose myself to other waters, and I just went like, oh, I come from a part of the world where we relate to money in certain ways, where we relate to our presentation in certain ways. Where we relate to someone said it once. It was like, I spent a lot of time being like, I'm normal and those are the rich people.
Mm.
And as I got older, I started to realize those are just kind of normal people. And I'm creating a lot of funny stories that I didn't know that I'm creating about who they are and how they live, and what are our basic needs. And so I think more than that, it's in the town that I was in particular, there was a lot of criminal activity, a lot of violence, a lot of poverty, basically, and I think it exposed me to a certain level of like woundedness that yeah. I mean, everyone's wounded, but there's a systemic woundedness, I think, when you're in a certain area. And so a lot of my life has been, as I've figured out, feeling a lot of suffering. And some of it's my suffering, and some of it's the suffering of the people around me, and the suffering that causes me. And yeah, since a very young age, it's like, I want to stop that suffering. What's the most effective way to stop that suffering? Yeah. So
thank you for sharing. Yeah. I'm curious, one thing I want to ask also about the earlier part of your life is when did you first start to encounter Bio-Emotive yourself as practicing it? Like, how did you learn it, and what was that like for you?
yeah, I distinctly remember being in my bedroom crying, and my dad coming in and practicing Gendlin's focusing, asking me, where do I feel the sadness in my body? What color is it? Is it moving? And I remember being like, it's yellow. It's yellow. The pain is yellow. It's moving. But I knew, like, at that moment, this is helpful. This is really helpful. That type of the abstractness of the introspection gave me something, even at that age. Yeah.
Was there kind of an arc after that of you learning more about it and practicing it more?
Yeah, I would say just as he developed it over the years, what came first, which was the core feelings. No, what came first was I forgot about this. It's okay to cry. And then, in fact, I pieced together, said, it's okay to cry. That's the fact that you cry is showing that you have an open emotional system and you're accessible. You can feel other people because you remain open. And so I actually remember choosing to stop crying so that I could stop feeling other people's pain. And so I remember, if you have a pain in your throat, that's you holding back tears. And so I would consciously hold back my tears so that I could develop a little bit of a buffer. And then, yeah, as time went on, it just sort of developed and grew. And I don't think it had a direct impact. I mean, it impacted my life because I grew up around it and I had a safe space to cry and process my feelings. But it wasn't until like my mid-20s or 30s that I started to maybe pay more attention to it in an obvious way. And yeah.
I know that a big part of my own interest in Bio-Emotive has been basically that I didn't cry mostly for, I don't know exactly how long, but a very long time. And learning Bio-Emotive and working with your dad was part of what helped me to start to cry again. And I wonder, as you've been exposed to it and sharing it with people, is your sense that the reason that you named that you sort of would shut down crying, is that common for most people, or are there different reasons for different people, or how do you make sense of that based on your experience?
Well, I think most people will stop crying consciously or unconsciously, and if they're not crying consciously, it's because they're being told don't cry, so they're holding it back, or it's been delivered to them at such a young age that they've learned how to hold it back before they're even speaking, like before 4 years old. I think it's fairly rare to, like in my situation of consciously not crying, to not feel people. But definitely we shut down our emotional systems because it's too much to feel people's pain. A lot of the work in my meditation practice is learn to expand your capacity for discomfort and heartache, so that discomfort and heartache doesn't send you into a tornado of uncontrollable emotion. You can have access to that equanimity and the pain. And as they say, like, not turn away. But yeah, like I think our nervous systems and our bodies, we are designed to block out the actual intensity of this world. Yeah, for sure.
What does it look like for you to, in your practice, gain that capacity to feel into the discomfort and suffering of the world?
So my bias is the choice to lean towards compassion. And for me, compassion shows up as kindness and kind redirection. I just lost what you said, but I have, can you repeat it? I'm all, yeah.
Sure. In your meditation practice, what has sort of growing this capacity to experience pain and heartache and the suffering of the world, what does that look like?
So, so my bias is compassion, and to not fall into my own triggers or my own unconscious responses. So if I can be with someone else's discomfort, that means I can be with my own discomfort, which means I have a little bit of space to choose, how do I actually be calming and kind rather than go into a reactive state. And I guess adding upon that, I appreciated the guy that you brought on who did shadow work. How can I wake up to my own blind spots? So where am I unconsciously doing the thing that I'm against? And that's a really major practice for me. Is there a way that I'm doing the thing? Am I doing the thing right now or in my life that I don't like that you're doing? And where is that? And so in order to actually look at that, I have to be able to be with discomfort. And one more comment on that is, you know, as a helper, it's how, and I would say both of my parents have modeled this really well for me, as well as a few Dharma teachers. It's like you just keep meeting the moment. And if the moment needs more love, like how do you wash away into that slightly wider expanse? How do you wash away into that slightly wider expanse? Right? And that often involves noticing discomfort and transmuting it.
I love the body language that you had demonstrating that. Yeah, facial expressions are really beautiful. You may not feel like sharing, but to whatever extent you'd like to share, I'd be curious to ask about some of these memories of times where you were doing the thing that you that was triggering for you or that you noticed in the world.
Let me so I worked I loved working with kids when I was younger. I loved babysitting. I loved working in foster care. And, you know, these kids would be lying. And then I'd be like, yeah, but like our whole team lies to them every day about where their meds are kept and what we're doing. Like all we do is lie to them. Or, geez, these kids they're constantly saying no. They're always no. They're just in resistance to everything. They're just no. And I'm like, all we do is say, no, don't do that. We're not showing them how to disagree with something without brute force. So that was when it kind of first became illuminated to me of like, there's something in like humanity's consciousness that like we do the things that we don't like. Myself, I become my archetype, my like extremeness, I can fall into tyranny. So like everyone needs to do what I'm saying because it's the right thing and it's the compassionate thing to do. And if we're not all doing our self-work, wow. And something that a recent kind of insight that I had, I was working through something with my partner, and I realized the more I spend time trying to solve macro issues, the less time I'm spending with my micro community.
Mm.
So if I'm saying the world needs to process their emotions, sometimes I'm not actually giving the time and attention to my immediate family members
Mm-hmm.
that are needing that loving support. So then I turn my attention to my family, and suddenly I've abandoned the system because I'm just thinking about me and I'm just thinking about us and our well-being and what we need. It's just like, I'm one of the people contributing to the problems, right? But it's been, it's that's dharma, that's life, that's holding that paradox, right? Is we're working with it, or we're finding the giggle, the hilarity, and like, oh yeah, I guess back to the drawing board,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Coming back to Bio-Emotive, you mentioned, I forget the exact phrase you used, but sort of some of the work that you have done has involved finding like a structure for sharing it with people and bringing it to more people. And I'd be curious to hear more about that work that you've done and just generally how you've been involved with sharing Bio-Emotive with the world.
Sure. So Bio-Emotive, it's kind of like the rational person's entry point into emotions. And our emphasis is on, the emotional brain, the limbic system. And that's basically, we're saying, let's go into the nonlinear world of images, associations, sensations in the body, perspectives, and kind of like just by going in there, we're gonna like figure out some things, and we're gonna release some things, and it's all gonna work out great. Now my dad, he figured out the core feelings, he figured out, Nadura, all of that. But like when you really start trying to explain Nadura as though it's this step-by-step sequence, you start to realize like certain things blend in together and certain things aren't as linear as it looks. So figuring out how to translate the non-linearness into the most linear thing that I can, so that anybody from any background can perceive what I'm pointing to, despite their exposure to emotional processing or not. Yeah, that's taken a few iterations of work. And then also, and unfortunately, I'm now falling into the same category as my father. So some of it was like translating it from psychologist speak, which, keep in mind, he did this like 15 years ago. So not everyone was up in the limbic system, and not everyone was up on the nervous system and neuroscience. How do you translate it to just like the average person that can hear it? Now, unfortunately, he and myself now, we just take certain things for granted. Like it just doesn't occur to us that we have to explain certain things, because we're also surrounded by a bunch of people who process their emotions, and we're people like you who are interested or doing your own research. Is that helpful? Is there something more specific I could say, or?
That is helpful. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear as well how, since it's been such a long time, sort of how Bio-Emotive has, from your perspective, changed over time, and what's grown or been added or been subtracted or changed.
Well, the framework itself has been fairly solidified. It started off as, why is everyone crying on these same feelings? That was kind of insinuated by my mom, or implicated by my mom. He kind of took that and ran, and then from there he found the triune brain. But where we've grown, I would say, as an organization, is recognizing, so when this came out, everyone was not into emotions, not into feelings. He got a lot of pushback and kickback, dismissing what he was doing. But now there are a lot of people doing a lot of emotional work. And people are coming to us as the emotions experts. So they're wanting us to basically explain to them not just our framework, but how to live a healthy life. So we're having to actually teach where we used to emphasize, like, you can't just keep coping, with these dysfunctional coping mechanisms. You have to go deeper, you have to resolve it. Now we're also having to say, no, you don't have to process every single thing in every single moment that it arises, right? Like, it's okay to suppress it to the end of the day. It's okay to learn certain emotional regulation. So it's been more like our learning curve has been figuring out what role have we ended up in, and how can we tend to what people are asking for. And it's a little different, like teaching the Bio-Emotive Framework versus teaching how do you relate to emotions in general. Because relating to it in general comes with, when do I not cry? Right? And so we have to start giving those teachings as well. When do I not dive into something? And that's, I think, a whole dynamic with a lot of the communication practices, the interpersonal practices, a lot of the self-development practices. We go to these containers, we have these amazing experiences, and then we come back home and we want everyone to speak in I statements, and we want everyone to be speaking the deepest truth of what they really mean underneath the different layers that they have. And then if we're not getting met in that way, we're feeling like, so there's this kind of full pendulum swing. And so that's been, a lot of my work has also been kind of, there's the emotional clearing parts, and then there's the interpersonal navigation of emotion. And so in my coaching, I do a lot of the clearing work, and I'll teach, here's how to do it. But there's a lot of nuances in having interpersonal relationships where you're doing and acknowledging emotions. One thing that's really important, that we used to emphasize a lot more, we probably should emphasize it more, is your emotional clearing is your own work. So you want to clear your charge. You want to clear your historical stuff before you have the conversation. You want to figure out, why does that person trigger me? What's it bringing up in my own life? What core feeling am I feeling that I'm reacting to that I don't want to feel? Do I need to cry that out of my system? Once that emotional charge is cleared from my system, now I can talk to them more rationally, more succinctly, with more rational expectations of them. Whereas a lot of the interpersonal containers are basically saying, I have a charge, bring it to the person and start going back and forth. And that only works if both people have really good skill sets. Otherwise, we end up bringing our charge, dumping it on someone, and then they're just kind of splattered with all of this emotion they have no idea what to do with. And then that creates a lot of issues. I could teach a course on this. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's part of the growing, communities and consciousness as a collective, like it evolves, right? And so we're all going through these learning curves together.
on the clearing side, I would be curious to hear you talk about feeling beliefs, which are sort of, in my understanding, sort of like below the core feelings, or like something you find after the core feelings. But yeah, I would be curious to hear you speak to what those are and how you make sense of them.
Yeah. I just have to comment, I'm appreciating how you drop in and find your questions. Very grounding for me.
Thanks for saying that.
So feeling beliefs are based on unresolved core feeling impressions, and they are basically the generalization that a person creates in order to integrate an unresolved experience. So it involves what generalization have I made about myself and my relationship to the world? And oftentimes it's a bit skewed. So basically, so in our framework, we'll take in an early impression of helplessness. So, you know, your parents are yelling all the time. It's loud. That loud yelling, when the emotional system is open, creates an imprint, an impression. That imprint or that impression, that kind of stamp in a moment says, the world is loud and chaotic, and it's better to be as small as possible. That way, I'll avoid pain or danger. It's like a lesson. The coping strategy, or the lesson that you learned on how to cope with a tough situation when you were young. And it's better to be quiet than to speak my truth, because I'll just get laughed at. Or it's better to hiding my true feelings, because I'll get rejected. And so we walk around with these feeling beliefs, and they end up kind of shaping or distorting how we perceive how people are relating to us. So if I'm always feeling, if I have unresolved feelings of insignificance, and my feeling belief is, no one wants to hear what I say, then in a group conversation, if I'm sharing something that I care about, and then the next person that speaks doesn't say, wow, I really loved what you said, but instead they just take that awesome energy of what you said that was so great, and they riff on it and they keep chatting about it, you're living in two different realities. They're going, man, this person's amazing. They're talking about the coolest stuff. It's got my brain going. Wow. But you're living in the world of, I don't matter enough to that person for them to even acknowledge a thing that I said. Yeah. It's brutal. It's brutal. And that's where I love the interpersonal healing spaces, because then you have someone that actually says, like, hey, can I check reality? Like, I notice I'm feeling super insignificant and dismissed. And I know that I carry a feeling belief that my voice doesn't matter, but like you just did the thing. And then you can actually check what happened. But that doesn't always happen. So we go just watching ourselves, speaking up, no one responding, and we just believe it more and more. I really don't matter. I really don't matter. My voice really doesn't matter. And so we play it out, and we keep playing it out because we're not interrupting that pattern. Yeah.
And how do you, from the perspective of the Bio-Emotive Framework, notice and resolve these feeling beliefs?
You notice them by going, there seems to be a pattern that I keep getting into. And you get curious about that pattern. You say, what could I be bringing to the table that I'm not aware of? And then you say, okay, is there a core feeling that I keep feeling, that I'm feeling it so deeply that I'm not even aware that I'm feeling it? And you look and you check, do I feel insignificant? Check for resonance. Do I feel helpless? Check for resonance. And you explore. So you notice that you have a feeling belief by noticing there's a pattern that I keep getting into, or that other people keep doing to me. So this is like that radical self-responsibility thing. I'm the common denominator in all of my issues. So what's the thing that I could be bringing to how people are treating me? And then it's very helpful to have someone to talk to, like someone else who knows, like hash this out. But your shadow work friend, I mean, he works with this. It was very clear. Lots of therapeutic tools find this. Our thing is there's a feeling hidden in it. Like there's a moment, an impression, or multiple impressions that solidified this belief. And in that belief, there's a feeling that you don't want to feel, or a feeling that you're afraid of updating. And that's kind of what separates us from a lot of the other modalities. What's the feeling? And then how do you clear it? You create space to create positive impressions. So create the opportunity to be like, oh, maybe they do love and value and appreciate my perspective. And in fact, they just told me that I did. And in fact, I don't believe them. So I'm going to ask them, can you tell me again that you value me? Because I can tell that I'm not receiving it. Like I have all of these blocks and disbeliefs. Are you sure? Right now, do that in an appropriate friendship, right? If you're in a partnership and you're constantly asking for validation, it can be a bit of a difficult dynamic. But my point is try to update your impression and try to actually see. This is where that woman who does like the work, is it true? Does that person actually think I'm insignificant? Right? And you start to learn the difference between what's happening in the moment versus what's all my historical stuff that like I don't really need to be feeling anymore.
As you say that, I'm remembering that one of the interactions that we've had that stuck with me was we were circling with a very large group, I think, and I was talking about something about, I think it was some like high school stuff of like, I remember it being associated with like popularity dynamics and like just being aware of whether people liked me or not. And you responded by reflecting like, people love you. And the way you said it was just, it was so kind and so sweet, but also so straightforward. And I was like, oh, whoa, she's right. Like people love me. Like what? I did not notice that about this community until you said that, just like matter of factly. And then I've been able to notice since then, like, oh, people tend to really love me. Like, okay, interesting. That's so sweet. Yeah. So I owe that to you and thank you.
Oh, that honestly lights me up so
Mm.
obviously. So in that moment, what you could do is, if you're like, okay, I've taken in the impression people actually do love me and think I'm great. But if you're noticing, and yet some part of me keeps forgetting, now you can say, okay, what are some of the early impressions I took in that I haven't resolved yet, that I need to make peace with?
Mm-hmm.
And that is where you might bring in some parts work or some updating, like you imagine what's the better outcome. If I could redo that situation, what would the better outcome be? Or do I just need to let that part of me grieve and cry and hold myself as a younger child?
Mm.
And you take passes. Like sometimes you clear it immediately, it's gone, it's magic, wow. And sometimes it's like 3 or 4 years later, you're like, oh, okay. But maybe there's something still there.
Mm.
Yeah, people do love you. I'm glad you took that in. It was
Yeah.
very obvious and clear to me.
Yeah. Well, and what I'm appreciating now too about that interaction was, I don't know, I've seen, you and your dad, and I've also met your mom. Haven't seen her as much, but I've seen you and your dad uh, facilitate things in a sort of formal way, and it's just incredible. And I want to ask about that in a second. But also, it's like this was a large circle with like I think 30 people or something, and you just like snuck that in and sort of. It would not like you had an agenda or something, but it was just a casual comment as a friend that had that same impact for me, and I, still remember it to this day. So thank you again for that. Um, this is a total aside, but I think something I've been thinking about recently is like just how momentous our actions are, our speech or our facial expressions or the choices we make, because something like that can stay with someone for years or decades or impact their life in such tremendous ways, like, positive or negative. And, all of these small things that we do in our life uh, can be huge for someone else or have such a huge impact in the world. And it's very weighty. So that was one such moment for sure. Um, yeah, so I'm curious to ask about the facilitating of Bio-Emotive and, again, sort of seeing you or your dad or other people do just what initially seemed like magic. Like, how do they do that? And how do they come up with these phrases or feel into that? And, over time, I've gotten a bit of a sense of it myself, and um, both with Bio-Emotive and other similar things. But I'd be curious to ask what you all have learned over the years about how to share that skill set with people and how to teach them to facilitate Bio-Emotive for other people.
Mhm. So first and foremost, just supportively listening goes a long way.
Mm.
And in fact, the field that gets generated in your nervous system of just choosing to take a breath, drop in, and give all of your attention to that person, and give all of your attention with the choice of saying, like, I lovingly care and receive what's happening for you. And I invite safety for you to be with whatever's here. If that's where you're starting, one, that's the right foundation if you're going to facilitate someone through Bio-Emotive, as opposed to we're gonna solve this, which I can totally get into with my clients. Yeah, but that loving trend, that loving energetic space is really important. So it works once you're there to actually go into the process, but it also works to just be with them and let them self-process however they do. Okay, so that's really important. And the next is I mean, without like going into like, here's how to do it. Like, I guess my hesitation is like, I could go into like a 30-minute like teaching on it, which I don't know if right. Are there blocks that you've had in like, hey, I'm trying to show up for someone and I don't quite know how to show up for them?
I don't know. I think I've actually done a fair number of facilitating sessions of Bio-Emotive over the years, and it's really helpful. And it's less like, well, I guess, yeah, it's less like blocks for me in particular, and more a curiosity of, on the whole, like framework level, what you've learned over the years of something like, oh, we thought that we would need to do this, but actually we found this works better or something. And then just in on the sort of human level of what this is all about, of holding that kind of space.
So in the beginning, and it's still true, but we've had to refine how we articulate it. We use the word resolve, okay? And so resolve basically means, how do I make peace with? How can I be at peace with the fact that X happened? Now, oftentimes, if someone actually has positive impressions in their life, just by saying the dynamic out loud, talking about the feeling, they hear themselves and they go, that's ridiculous. I am great. Huh. And that updating happens immediately. Okay. Like what happened with you. That's a perfect example. You were like, wait a second. Update. But some people actually don't have a bunch of positive impressions. So they actually have to go out and create those impressions. They have to pursue a healthy community that says loving and kind things to them. They have to, that's part of where we added, I think that was me, I said we need an action step at the end. And my dad said, yeah, that actually makes sense. Like sometimes people need to actually go do the morally right thing and apologize. They're never going to be at peace with themselves. They're never going to have that sense of resolve until they actually close the loop. And that's also been important. The danger of focusing on take action at the end is people can just make it a action oriented process and they forget to actually feel their feelings. But that has a place too. And for me, when I'm coaching, I end up doing a lot of, I have the person say the sentence. Like, okay, so you're feeling, so when I speak up, I feel like no one's listening. Okay, can you say that back out loud? When I speak up, I feel like, okay, does that sentence want to change in some way? When I speak up, I feel like no one's listening and I don't matter. Oh, so that brings deeper resonance to your body. Oh, okay. So I spend a lot of time clarifying the sentences of what someone's feeling before I look for a core feeling. And then I think the final comment, I think we've known this from the beginning, but it is important. So the steps is notice you're activated, experience your body as you're experiencing it, find differentiation. Through that differentiation, express, which is say it out loud or cry, and test for resonance. Am I moving in the right direction or do I need to move in a different direction? And then test for resonance. You do it enough times until you feel a sense of resolve. Some people are really good at some of those steps, but they need practice with other steps. So I will spend I will say, forget about Nadura right now. Just tell me your story. And I'll get someone to talk about their story until they're so emotionally amped up and charged that they're actually feeling something. And once they're charged, then I'll start trying to figure out the deeper layers. And other people, I'll say, we're not going to actually differentiate anything. I need you to learn how to feel your body. Like, and we'll do movement exercises to get them into spontaneity and free expression and just being in relationship to their body. Once they're in relationship to their body, then they can start seeing what they're feeling inside. So yeah, sometimes I just focus on certain parts of the process depending on who I'm working with and what it seems like they're needing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for talking at such length about this framework and your experience of it. And it's just been so helpful to me over the years, and it's lovely to hear more about it from you. Yeah, so I'd love to shift to talking about we spaces. Maybe to set a little context for that. I think, yeah, you were the first person that told me about these several years ago, and still feel like there's a lot more to learn, and the conversations that we've had about them have kind of stayed with me and really informed a lot of the thinking that I've had about different experiences I've had since then. And maybe I'll share more about the specifics of things that I've experienced later, but maybe just to start, could you share from your own experience how you started to encounter this territory, and what happened in your own life and that exposed you to these ideas?
Yeah. So for me, I had a lot of things fused together, which over time I've learned to kind of differentiate and clarify. So I'll just do some basic kind of definitions. These are how I've come to see it and define it. One, we've got we space, and we space is basically a generated energetic between two people. It's two nervous systems working together. So it's like a shared state of calm. It's oxytocin. It's this dropping in, and there's kind of like a group flow. It's a flow state between people. You can get there through lots of different meditation practices, relational practices, authentic relating, eye gazing, dance, movement. You can create these we spaces. You feel them a lot in powerful spiritual centers. So if you go work with a Buddhist teacher, or the temple, whew, I feel that. Okay, that's a flavor of we space. I differentiate that flavor of we space as different than collective intelligence, as different than group mind. So collective intelligence is more like the ability for a group to work together and have the ability to function as the sum is larger than its pieces. So there's coordination involved in collective intelligence. There's kind of a pre-trans version of collective intelligence. So you've got basically the people who have to submit or ignore or destroy your individual gifts, capacities, inquiries, and loves to serve a larger group. or the more transcendent form is you take everyone's individual gifts, capacities, and arrange them in such a way that you're all working together for a larger collective intelligence. Okay. And both of them have value, but obviously we prefer the one where we're all working together more cohesively. I think that happens in a lot of like heart-based leadership in corporations. Like how do you bring the individual to the collective? And then the final one I call group mind, and that is basically a very deep meditative space between a group of people where you're basically channeling information that no individual could actually get access to. But between each of us, we're able to receive certain nuances. So that happens all the time. Like you get a bunch of geeks together and get them talking, and people have insights and ideas. What's going on? You go to work. We had this at my art space all the time. Like we were constantly in a state of group mind. We were constantly bringing down amazing ideas, clarifying what made it work, how do we manifest it, all of that. And the difference is through kind of my own funny experience, I went, wait a second. If you get everyone together in the right way and you don't shut down a natural process that's trying to take place, really amazing things can happen. Yeah, so yeah, maybe we'll riff a little bit back and forth now from this.
To clarify something I'm hearing that I might be misunderstanding, but it sounds like we spaces are a bit more like perceptions or like perceptual experiences, like flow states, and then the second one of collective intelligence sounds much more focused on behavior and action. Is that a fair distinction to make, or is that not correct?
I like that. I would say the collective intelligence, as I'm pointing to it, is more action oriented. The we space, I would say, is more of it's a physical transmission. It's a shift of a physical state of mind, which creates a certain state of mind. A shift in the body creates a state in the mind. Yeah.
And you mentioned this a little bit with the sort of like art spaces you're in or other creative projects you've been, but can you talk more about your own background with these experiences and what your own personal history with them has been?
So I think my first real exposure, my mom used to lead group meditations, and one of the kind of like sentences that my dad would say is he would say, your mom creates she opens a good space. Your mom really creates the space. And so that languaging kind of came to me, and it was like, it was true. You walk into a room and it was like, you could feel the space. Okay. The next thing was I did something called Star Group with a meditation teacher called Lama. His name is Lama Lodro. And that was where we would go into a silent meditation and we'd do a shared visualization. And what would happen is, and then we'd put our hands in a posture. So you sit like this, one like this, you close your eyes, you visualize a dome of blue above you. And the idea is that you visualize yourself leaving the dome and exploring what's going on. And then also everyone's hands is being held like this. So there's kind of this generation of energy being exchanged. Well, that's a story, but you start to feel physical sensations in your body as you're meditating. And basically I had two really mind-blowing experiences. I was like 18, probably like 21 maybe, where we all came out and we all saw like the same images. And that was like, that went against every, I grew up in a very rational family. Okay. We did not have like magic and mystery in our meditation practice. We were like, these are two trained psychologists, expressive therapists. Everything had mode and reason. And so there I was having a shared experience of images. Yeah, that blew my mind. And then also I had a deep experience of like really deep peace. How come I can't sit for 5 minutes by myself, but I can sit in a group of 15 people for an hour and not have any body pain? So those were two kind of beginnings of there's something that happens here when we sit in groups. The next kind of wave was I was at the Integral Spiritual Conference. No, the Integral Living Room, the first Integral Living Room with Di Hamilton, bless her amazing heart, Terry Patton, Jeff Salzman, and Ken Wilber. And they asked us a question. What's an integral conversation? And our group, for whatever reason, we were sitting on the floor. We were all, our knees were touching. And we were just like in this like really amazing conversation. And at some point, one of the women across from me said, I started noticing all of our posture. Sometimes we were leaning in, and then sometimes we leaned back. And we looked kind of like this like jellyfish. And I started talking about that. And I was like spewing out all this really wise stuff. And the woman across from me said, "You're channeling. Let me get a pen and paper." And I was like, I don't really believe in channeling, but okay. So she got a pen and paper and she started writing down the things that I was saying. And as that happened, what was happening was I was basically having like a meta experience. And people use meta in a funny way. But anyway, I started to see how we are talking about this is helping us to discover new insights and new information. And there's ways that we can block this. We can block these insights from happening. And so what was shown was there's the quiet person who doesn't say anything, who's in a deep state of just something. They're just like that bear energy, that boom, that laughing Buddha, that wow. Our grandpas, you know, a lot of our grandpas have that energy. It's just wow, this field. Okay. Then there's the channel that I was the mouthpiece. And then there was the challenger or the critiquer. And this person just had a problem with everything I said. They were like, that's not rational. This is ridiculous, blah, 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 blah. But everything that they said forced me to clarify what I meant. Okay. And as I clarified it, someone else was mapping it on. They're like, actually, that makes a lot of sense what she's saying, because in this theory, blah, 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 blah. And actually, that makes a lot of sense of what she's saying, because in this theory, blah, 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 blah. Right? And that just kept happening. So he kept challenging me, and he kept actually sense making it into relevant scientific reality. And then, of course, the woman across, she was writing it down. And for a while, because I used to have a very consistent meditation practice, I was able to take this kind of download, this and create spaces where I could replicate it. I could kind of set it up so it was happening. Herschel actually was the first person that he called me out on something at the monastic academy. He said, "It seems like you keep trying to cast a spell on us or on the group, and then we break it." And I was like, it's an interesting way of putting it. But I realized he was right. I was trying to get the group into a certain state of flow, right? What I've learned since then is that those 5 roles are in each of our own minds as sense-making capacities. So even if it's not being, because it's hard, like that's a high level thing to get everyone together where all of the energy is flowing, everyone's chakras are opened, they're working with their body, their emotional intelligence and their intellect. And like, it's actually extremely advanced. But what I did recognize was that was actually a macro replication of what's happening internally, right? So you could see it on the outside. And so what I find really interesting about that is I started, my mom used to do a type of group practice in the early 80s. And she would say that she would say that her teacher liked working with her because she could play multiple roles. She could move between many posts. And what I found interesting is you start to see these types of people in all communities. And, you know, the channel is the girl that doesn't stop talking and everyone can't stand. Okay. I'm being really like extreme in how I'm doing this. The challenger might be the class clown who's poking at the teacher and picking apart what's being said. The map maker is the geek who's always like, well, that relates to. Okay. And then the ground is like the quiet guy in the background who's just kind of like taking all the shit. Right. And so it's like everyone is living their roles and often getting in trouble or criticized or shut down for it. But if we could learn to actually honor, hey, that kid that's always quiet, that's always staring out the window, or that challenger that's always a little bit like all over the place, their nervous system is actually relating to the energy in a room. And they're processing that information differently than how, you know, we might think is appropriate. But they're actually bringing gifts to this space, and they're bringing gifts to the classroom. I'm thinking of like, you know, 10-year-old kids, right? Like they're bringing gifts here. If we can learn to actually work with those gifts, we don't have to be shaming them for who they are. We can be letting them grow those capacities. Yeah.
How did you start to make the distinctions between, that you mentioned earlier, between we spaces, collective intelligence, and group mind?
Because I was hearing a lot of people use the word we space, and it wasn't what I was talking about. And so I had to start figuring out, what are people talking about? So I just spent a lot of time observing, basically. You know, I'm going to forget about the language that they're using. What are they talking about? And over time, I started to see these different distinctions start to emerge. Yeah.
And when you were trying to Herschel was talking about like casting that spell, and before that you were like trying to intentionally recreate these spaces like the one you were originally in. What did you do to go about creating those spaces?
I directed energy through word and movement. The thing was I was surrounded by high energy, high frequency, like flowing people. So my energy field was in a really great state of flow and circulation. We're not always surrounded by people or communities that are creating amazing energy circulation. Which has also been like an awesome learning process for me to be like, okay, so like the thing that used to happen naturally isn't happening. Oh, I used to hang out at like Tibetan Buddhist centers all the time. And like people that have done like 40 years of meditation practice and worked with this day, and then it just becomes different when you're like, how come this isn't working? And I think a lot of the circling communities, it started off as like, there were a lot of really high level, deeply practiced people in those spaces. And it slowly got shared with more and more kind of just like the average Joe. And the average Joe doesn't have their energy flowing in certain ways, oftentimes.
You're sort of hovering on saying this, but what's your sense of what the prerequisites are for someone to be able to enter these kinds of spaces with other people?
Already have an awareness of the arising and passing away of thoughts, emotions, and sensations. An awareness of how to clear emotional blocks or notice them. So one of the major things is like, if you actually just notice that it's blocked by naming it out loud, that often relieves the tension and you can go back to the work that you're doing. But if you don't notice it, or you don't know how to work with it, or you don't know how to name it, you just get pulled in to the block playing itself out. And I would say people have to have the capacity to move their energy between the base of the spine up and through. So be able to empty out enough to allow energy to flow. And because otherwise you just get triggered. There's a difference between being triggered by everything that's being said and shutting down a process versus kind of playfully, debatefully pointing out a flaw in someone's logic. One of them is a state of flow and play. The other is a contraction. And I think I'm recognizing, like, for anyone who's listening to this, like, there's a lot of hidden steps in between. Like I'm writing this out so that it's much more clear. Like right now we're just kind of like alluding to this thing, but there's definitely a lot there. Yeah.
Maybe now would be a good time to put my own cards on the table, and we've talked a little bit about this, but I'd be curious to sort of make sense of some of these things together. But I know at the time when you first introduced this idea to me, I think it would have been late 2019, December 2019 probably. I had been doing a lot of circling that year, and something I was really interested in school, I got very interested in philosophy. And I remember whenever I would circle, I was really interested in what philosophers would talk about as like an epistemological question of how do you know things? how do you know what you know? Or in circles, it was like, often I think someone else is having this experience. How do I know? Is that just what I think, or are they actually having this experience? And um, there would start to be sometimes similar things happening on a group level, where it wasn't just a question of, oh, I think this other person is sad or angry or, you know, really excited about this thing or whatever. But I think that the group as a whole is having this experience of almost like there's a object on the table that we're all looking at. And I think we all see that object there, except it's not a physical object. It's some sort of concept or feeling or perception about the social reality or something like that, like something that we're all tapped into. And the way you were talking about it helped to make sense of those kinds of experiences, and almost make me want them more, of like, oh, these are amazing when this happens. I didn't know that it was possible to connect with other people like that. And then I was also aware that it's very finicky, like very hard to, it's like very fragile. When it's there, it's like, oh, this is great. Like, yes, please, more of this. And then when it's not there, it's like, oh, I'm pissed at everyone in the circle and fuck this shit. I'm never doing that again. Well, that was me anyway. But yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well,
so Mhm.
So what comes up is so circling is very interesting, because on some level, the power of circling, as it was taught to me in the early days, was you only spoke in first person perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You only spoke my experience. Okay. Group mind allows you to talk about third person perspectives. Okay. But the power of only speaking in your first person experience is a certain state gets generated when everyone is suddenly introspecting of like, what is happening? Oh yeah. Oh, and it takes you into this level of, you're seeing cause and effect, but you're translating it through me and my experience. And I have a story that you're saying this based on the fact that you held your breath when they said that. So it like opens up this like extrasensory perception. Okay. When you're in a circle with everyone who's done a bunch of emotional clearing work, who isn't afraid of looking at themselves, who takes every offering or objection as something to be curious about, major energy can flow. Major insights, major breakthroughs. The energy goes exactly to the person, and someone says the thing that needs to be said that pokes them on the exact spot, and they burst open and all the tears happen, and it frees someone from this projection that they've been doing, and it's just like, and it's like, whoa. It's incredible. Yeah. Those of us who have been in those circles, we know it. So to me, that's this like divine intelligence. That's this like higher thing that when we're all clear enough to be danced, we dance. Mm-hmm. But if we have this block and this block and this assumption and this judgment and this inability and that, hey, and what the heck, then a circle is not that divine intervention. It's one, got a great facilitator who's helping you unpack amazing moments and discover shared reality. Or two, it's a bunch of people's pain getting slung at each other. And unfortunately, if you've been facilitated by an amazing facilitator, then you have this experience of, I can bring my pain full force and something magical is going to happen. So then you go to your next circle and it's not being facilitated by that magical person, and it's not being held by 15 other magical people. And now you've just brought all of your stuff, slung it in the room, and hell breaks loose. And it's just like, oh. And so that was where when I was running my community, like I had to really watch, like, why is this magical sometimes? And why is this really bad sometimes? And as much as every circle is perfect and you don't want to accept anything, I was like, some people are leaving traumatized. I am not okay with that. I have to figure out what's going on here. Yeah. Yeah. So there's like a degradation. There's like a spectrum of a circle.
Yeah. From hell to heaven, basically.
Basically.
Yeah. I've been in both. So
yeah. Many of us have. Yeah.
What did you learn from that careful watching over time of what made them really fruitful and what made them traumatizing, and how do you like to facilitate or set up circles now?
Oh, great questions. Values. Is everyone coming to the circle or the community, we'll say, with shared values and intentions? Skill sets, and I'll say capacity. So there's kind of two elements to circling. Some circles, there's a value system and a practice of transparency. Truth, speak the truth, speak the raw, honest truth, and trust that it's going to get us somewhere. If you're speaking a raw, honest truth, and you don't have people who have experienced or have the capacity to be with raw, honest truth, and it sends them into a trigger, you're going to need the skills to work with the triggered person and the person who just gave a raw, honest truth. And if in the beginning, I would say all of those things were fused together. Everyone had skills, everyone had capacity, everyone had life experience. And in certain ways, circling, it's the practice that a lot of people have been looking for. And this just gave it a form. But those people are the Jungian psychologists, the Tibetan yogis, the landmark graduates, the Burning Man, self-development, heart-based corporate guys. Like, they're the people who have done the deconstructive work. And so they're just looking for a place to speak their truth and check that nuance and see if that's really true and actually get feedback. Oh my God, you're right. I always do override you. Wow, thank you so much. They want that feedback, right? But they're coming to it already with a culture inside of them that is waiting for this type of practice. Okay, so I'm going to say those three again because it's like, and I'll add a fourth one because this was like 5 years of me trying to figure this out. Shared values and intentions. And in my experience, you have to actually care about the other people. Okay. If you're coming because all you want to do is have an emotional experience or practice your anger, that's a different container. Because if you don't actually care about someone else's well-being and you're only there to get a chance to let out your anger, that's not an interpersonal practice. Okay. And what you actually are wanting, and you don't know that you're wanting, is you want someone else to be receiving you and your rage and guide you through it. Okay. But in circling, it's a two-way practice. You have to be giving and receiving. Okay. So shared values and intentions that are agreed upon. The history that you bring, the level of self-development, self-awareness, previous practice, deconstruction and reconstruction that you already bring to the table. Skill sets. Okay. Just because I want to contain your anger doesn't mean I have the capacity to navigate the anger between you two. Okay. Capacity, can I actually be with intensity without disconnecting? And then I'll say a good facilitator. The facilitator kind of like weaves all of the things together. And so when everyone's kind of bought in the same way with the same desired outcome of no outcome, blah, 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 really powerful things can happen. Yeah. And I'm sure there's more I could say on that somewhere, but that's what's coming to me right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And do you practically like to limit circles like that to 5 people?
I love to play with the geometry of the space, and I really love to observe. You know, if you have a large, you know, circles, surrendered leadership circles, big circles of like 30 people, they're great to start off with, but allow it to self-select into a bunch of smaller circles. For me, 5 is ideal because as soon as there's 6, 7, or 8 people, for the actual group flow to happen, there's usually 1 to 3 people who are quiet, not saying anything, and often that silence is involving resentment.
Mm-hmm.
So I find it helpful to do 5, maybe 6, but I don't run circles larger than that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
4 can sometimes be actually like a box, like rigid, like it never quite gets anywhere. 3 I find effective, 2 I find effective. 4 is a bit, it's interesting. I mean, don't take it from me. Test it yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that brings up part of the other bit that's made me so excited about this kind of thing is especially in the last year or so, I've been just having lots and lots of conversations with lots of different people, and, you know, including recorded podcast conversations, but also other conversations. And I've just noticed over time, you know, there's sort of dyads, yeah, usually pairs. And I've noticed that who I experience myself to be and how I show up is very different with different people. And it's almost like different capacities are online with different people. And I have come to know over time, like, oh, if I want to do really deep emotional processing, I'll go to this person. Or, oh, if I want to do logistical planning, I'll go to this person. Or, oh, you know, there's other skills. It's like, I don't even know what that is, but we're doing that. And that's good. I'll go to this person. And in general, even when I'm just with, say, a new person or something, I'm kind of attuned to, oh, how am I showing up? How are they showing up? And what's the space here like? And even to the point of experiencing myself less as, oh, I'm Tasshin over here, which has been most of my life. And then more like, oh, I'm, you know, Tasshin Hoji right now. This is a different person than, you know, I'll be when this call ends, or I was before we got on a call or something like that. So 2 has been kind of a magic number for me. I'd like, I don't know, 3 often, 3 is very, very tricky for me. 4 is tricky. 5, yeah, I've had good experience with 5, 6, and 7. Nope. It just bumps over into like, it's really good for these 3, 4, or 5 people, and then just like awful for these 1, 2 people.
Right?
That like, and often I'm the one that's frustrated.
Oh, so you're the person that's always
usually there, you know, maybe there's some resentment to process through and feel through, find some feeling beliefs about. But anyway, yeah, 2 is great. And I think that's been sort of either a comfort zone or a space of play and practice that's become familiar to work with in a good way.
I just love that you're testing it out and like paying attention and noticing. That's really cool to me. Yeah. I find it interesting that 3s have not worked out.
Yeah. They're not my favorite. It depends. It depends, but it's much harder for me to feel at home with 3s, I think.
What's coming to my mind is when I put people in 3, there's often one person facilitating. So it's one person who's more of a space holder, like, I'm with you guys in what you're going through. And maybe that third person that's left off is always feeling like you two are in a conversation.
Yes.
So giving them that role to actually be able to do that.
Oh, that's really helpful. Yeah. I think that also reminds me of, I've historically really, really hated meetings, group meetings, like in business settings or professional settings of like, oh, we're doing this thing. And I think often the root cause of that is that there's not someone holding a clear leadership role, or if there is a person, that they're kind of doing it in a lukewarm way. And I just relax so much when someone's like, okay, here's what we're meeting for. We're going to meet for this time about this. Let's talk about this. And then this, oh, thank you. Thankfully,
Yeah.
someone's in charge.
But there's setting a clear container, so you know your boundaries. Then you can actually be in a state of free flow. Right. If you're always having to set the boundaries for yourself, then often we're regulating ourselves.
Yes. Which is really challenging around, I don't know, I find that challenging around a lot of other people, especially because usually like in this setting, for example, I can pay I can pay a fair amount of attention to you and your experience, and also track my experience, and like, oh, do you seem to be doing well, and like, are you enjoying yourself, like, is there anything you're needing, like, what's your body language happening, what are the things you're saying, and just attend to you and relate to you in a way that's responsive. And when it's more people, it's like you really can't scale that same kind of directed attention. I can, this is part of the hesitation, is like, oh, am I actually doing a great job at this today, sort of becoming self-conscious, but like, on the good days, you can really thank you you can attend to both yourself and the other person, and like really be with both of you. And then it's, I find it much harder to do that with more people. You can there's something analogous, but it's not like the same like co-presence of self and other.
I can super relate to that, and I immediately map that onto well, I mean, what I was saying earlier in my life. If I'm tending to the group, I'm not tending to the individual, basically. And if I'm tending to the individual, I'm losing track of the group. And like, I'm running a movement kind of theatrical healing group right now. And the irony is like, someone like me, I get into teaching and leading because I've had such mind-blowing, heart-opening experiences as a participant. I say, I want to do that too for people. And then as soon as I'm the one in charge of the space, I can't be attuned to the nuances. So then I'm doing the thing, which is not giving the attention to the people that they need, that always would bug me when I was in the class, because I'm having to tend to the whole group. Yes. Right. And I'm like, so I have, so now, but at least I can work with that consciously. Right. I've learned to accept I have to pay attention to the group. So I have an assistant, and I say, it's your job to notice everything that I'm missing and doing wrong, and fill it in, because I have to pay attention to the group space. Or if I'm really zeroed in on someone, I need you to be good enough to manage the group so that I can be with someone in their individuality. Right. And that's that collective intelligence. For this group to get what it needs, I can't do everything. I have to be okay with having help. I have to be okay with being limited. And if I have parts of me that want to prove my significance by doing everything, I'm going to run into problems. Right?
Because it's impossible.
Yeah.
That makes me think two things there. One is, might be a useful growth edge for me to start to attend to the group as a whole more. I don't know that I get that opportunity a lot these days, but I'll try to remember that as a thing to practice. I've definitely done that in the past in circles. It's just been a while, and I haven't done circling for some time, but that feels like a good growth edge, and I appreciate you pointing to that for me. And yeah.
Well, I'll add, I love the idea of you experimenting, like, oh, I could have a growth edge. And you could also say, so there's my growth edge, and then there's my gift. My gift is people's specifics. So maybe you just find someone else who's great at groups, and you work together. Both are valid.
Yeah.
right? It just kind of depends on which angle you want to take.
Totally. Well, and that actually made sense of, I ran a small retreat in September, and I was just remembering there was someone that I sort of had, I was running it with, and they were really good at this thing you're talking about. Like it seemed like they always noticed things and said things that were things I was just totally missing. I was like, oh wow, that's amazing, and thank you so much. And there was a good partnership, and that what you said helped make sense of that.
Yeah. But imagine if you didn't take that as a gift and you took
Mm,
it personally, like they were
mm,
trying to take your role or they were
uh-huh.
cutting you down.
Yeah,
Imagine the interpersonal challenge of that.
that would be hard. Thankfully, that wasn't. Yeah, thankfully there was enough spaciousness. Really, oh, they're adding the thing that needs to be stirred in. So thank you.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
amazing. That's
yeah.
great. Yeah.
Uh, mm, I'll remember to thank that person for that particular from this frame. So, um, so I'd be curious to ask if someone's hearing this conversation and they're like, oh, that sounds cool, but how do I do it? And how would I go in that direction myself? What advice would you give to people who might be interested in exploring these kinds of territories?
Mm-hmm. Um, so there's a lot of happening in the we space, and I would just look up relational meditations, um, collective presencing, um, uh, authentic relating. Um, I mean, I join my list. I offer things, but I don't specialize. Like I offer a pretty broad range of things. Um, yeah, and yeah, relational meditations. What are the other words? Social meditations, dyad practices. Um, uh, some of them fall under the guise of like interpersonal tantra practices. And that's where I would say anything where you're dropping in to the present moment and noticing your experience and naming your experience with someone else. Whatever version of that is likely good training that you want to develop for yourself in order to do more of the advanced stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also notice when you get energized, when you're listening to people. Notice when you're, oh, this is, all of these things are coming. Oh, wow, write down. You said it on one of yours. You were like, actually, I take notes and I get messages for people. Notice when that's happening. Notice who you're around, the type of people you're around. I was in Boulder, and this was my first time experimenting with this stuff, and me and my artist friend Sheena, she's a musician, great musician. We were like in this deep dropped in space, but there was this guy sitting at the other table. And I could tell, because I was in such a heightened state of awareness, his energy field was contributing to our capacity to channel and riff with each other.
Positively
he was
or
not part of
negatively?
the conversation. Pardon?
Positively or negatively? Like he was making a plus for it.
Positively.
Okay.
Yeah. Equally, in a different coffee shop in Boulder with my friend Sam, he and I were in this amazing conversation, and a man walked in, he walked by. I remember he was wearing a wolf t-shirt, and suddenly I couldn't, like, what was I saying? And it wasn't because I like entered into bliss. It was because it was like my signal got scrambled. And again, like I'm in a pretty heightened state, and I looked at him and I was like, Sam, I think that guy just interfered with our ability to flow. And you could tell he was a spiritual practitioner. I could tell that he had done work. My guess was like shamanic work. And I took that because there was a few spiritual teachers that I worked with that whenever I was with them, I would just start blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I'm showing up in this weird way with this person all the time. And I started to realize something about how they handle energy is scrambling my flow. Now, I'm not condemning them, and I'm not going to say to anybody anywhere, that's an energy vampire, that person's taking your energy, that person's low vibe. I'm really not into that. I'm into, let's observe how things work. So once I was able to observe his discomfort with my heightenedness caused him to do something to cope. I'm not going to let myself get shut down through his coping mechanisms and discomforts. So I learned to ground myself, take the extra time, look him in the eye, and speak. But when it was an unconscious thing, I just, yeah. So observe, just observe. It's Anapanasati, just observe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the way you were talking about it just now sounds less like, oh, this person's bad and I'm good, or I'm bad and they're good, and more like a dynamic like two people and how they mix and that kind of thing.
Totally. And that's, I think, the interesting thing. I think they did a lot of this work in like Vedic time. And now I think it's re-emerging. I don't know much about it. I've actually kept myself not very studied on it because I wanted to kind of get like a clean transmission of what was coming through me. But I think the future, and I think in workplaces, in the corporate world, if we can learn to honor actually the obnoxious person in the room that's always making the jokes, the comedian, they're actually like cleansing the space. And I had that. I dated a man. He was an idea generator, and someone close to him created the products. But those products could not be made without him being able to enter into this ideation zone, right? The guy that makes the product gets the money. So it starts to have very interesting implications around, well, whose idea was it? If we required a group to generate it, right? And suddenly taking claim and stake over certain things becomes a very different exploration.
Yeah, this kind of territory has been one of the best ways for me to make sense of and really get experience with myself of what like non-self type insights, because a lot of the meditation that I've done has been more about concentration, or frankly, I think I realized maybe halfway through my time meditating, I've been meditating, so I was like 19, I was like, oh, I need to do emotional processing. Okay, should learn Bio-Emotive. I should learn IFS. I should learn these other things. These are going to be, this is why meditation is so hard, because I keep, getting fired up about different stuff and needing to go back and learn that. And haven't done as much of the sort of insight practices. And then when I'm like, for example, having lots of conversations with people, it's like, oh, or writing or other things. It's like, oh, I'm not the one that's writing this thing. I'm not the one that's saying this thing. It's a co-created emergent thing from the space that's the presence of these multiple people or the influences that have happened. And it's not this guy,
Yeah. And that sounds like this like weird woo-woo thing, but it's like that's the originator of like having the muse, right? And I think that's what Peter is always talking about with his, whatever, I can't remember, from the Stoa. He's always, he's always talking about the daemon is moving through. Yeah, and I think like Evan and McCullen, I think his last name is. Yeah, when you can start noticing, oh, when we get together, ideas start to flow and something starts to happen. When you can start working with that consciously, and exactly, it's no self. There's an element of no self involved. And you don't have to have that no self through a Buddhist practice. You can just have no self because you're so into your writing that you start writing things that like this isn't me. That is an experience of no self. Exactly. Yeah. But then we reconfigure back into ourselves, and suddenly it's like, well, and we've got all of these ideas and needs and wants, right? And yeah.
How do you make sense to yourself of what these kinds of phenomena are? Like, do you think you mentioned nervous systems at a few points. Do you think it's from the physical body, or how do you make sense of what's happening?
I think a lot of what we call spiritual is limbic resonance. A lot of what we call transmission is mirror neurons and co-regulation between nervous systems. And then the energy that's generated, which I think they're now saying is more in the fascial system. That's where Chinese medicine, the energy flows. They're actually working with the fascia. I think it's all physical and it's all non-physical. But it's the inner technologies, it's the invisible technologies of us. And this is what the great spiritual practitioners, different witches over time, different Hindu temples, they were working with that energy that can happen when you disappear. Right? And we apply, because we live in such a scientific, rational time, we apply all this magical meaning to you disappear. And we create these layers of like, magical meaning. But actually, a lot of people get into these states a lot. And then it just becomes your nervous system's capacity to maintain and withstand deeper and deeper intensities of energy flow.
What you mentioned at one point, like these 5 rules that you found are also have like internal analogs that you can just have within yourself. Is there a way to connect to that or cultivate those skill sets internally?
I've never really thought about that question. I like that question. I would say notice it and love it. If like try to say, like you said, there's a growth point. Like so the unconscious challenger is just constantly challenging and poking away at people, and it's compulsive, right? They're stuck in the me and they're not flowing with the we. But the gift of the challenger is, hey, if you're working with the right person, you're able to point out flaws and nuances, and that nuance gets to be built upon. So I guess what's coming to me in the moment is notice different parts of yourself that you shame or reject or love, and just say, okay, what's the growth point and what's the gift? And then over time, you get to decide, if I'm someone who's always focused on growth, can I learn to just honor it as a gift and a limitation? It's okay to be limited. It's okay that this is my gift, and I tend not to be good at that.
It's a very kind phrase to hear. I feel warmed and like loved hearing that. Just, it's okay if I'm good at this, not good at those other things. That's really nice.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of at this point in your life where you are, anything that you'd like to grow in or learn more about with the kinds of things that we've talked about?
I mean, I would love at this point to actually start learning more traditional teachings in a deeper way. I've kind of done a lot of piecing stuff together myself, just kind of through observation. One thing else, like that this is not a direct answer to that, but I would love to see more coordination between, it's like, send people here to learn how to be present with their body and be in interpersonal dynamics. Send people there if they want to lean into challenge and conflict. Send people there if they want to move into more of the energetic spaces. And kind of let each, like, have just more coordination between what these gifts are of that these different people are running. And instead of like reinvent, like just starting the same business as someone else, it's like, how can we complement each other so that we're in deeper service, so that someone can go through your 3 programs and then come to my program. Because then I know that they've got that training. So that's kind of a dream of mine that I hold. I think that could emerge at some point. But yeah, I have been really influenced. Now I took theater for living training, which is a group theater process in working with dynamics in the group. And also I've been really blessed to learn a lot of different Indigenous teachings from the Korean Ojibwe people here. And I find that there's a lot of hidden wisdom in some of how they approach community. And so getting an opportunity to learn more about that, I think is also really interesting, and natural law.
Beautiful, beautiful. I hope also that you write about these things at some point. You shared some notes that you took with me, and I think you have a lot of wisdom that you've found through trying to find these things yourself, and I hope you share those in written form at some point.
Thank you. I am working on it. It will happen. Yeah, it'll happen. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that encouragement, though. Yeah.
We've covered a lot of territory. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk more about or speak more about?
No, this feels really lovely. Yeah, this was really, really nice. I'm interested to just learn more about your own journey and from space to space, what you've learned. And I'm particularly curious about these messages and how you're relating to the geometry of groups as well. Yeah. Now or another time, that's where my interest is right now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of curious about this word channeling in the context of what you've shared, because I guess you've encountered something I've said or written about this or something, but I think that at least how I currently hold it, I was sort of pursuing a certain spiritual archetype in my 20s when we met. And then I was like, oh, the role that I am is more of like a messenger and conveying some kinds of wisdom or discernment or something. And so there's a specific voice or set of voices that I've sort of unlocked over time, that when they share things, I like make sure to write those down and share them with the appropriate people, often publicly with the world, but also sometimes for me or for another person. And yeah, I think I still feel pretty new to that as a vocation of sorts, but it's similar, I think, to what you're talking about, except it's often catalyzed less by being in a group and more just from various circumstances that I find myself in and various interactions. And yeah, still making sense of what's happening there.
Yeah, what the image that comes to my mind is like how you relate to your environment. I find I'm feeling I'm getting this image of what would the world be like if people could identify as I'm like a messenger and I bring messages, and that's like an okay purpose to have, and like feel full and complete in that. Like that's amazing to me, because it's like, yeah, when that person says that thing at the time and it literally changes the trajectory of your whole life. And it's like, how are they so dropped in and see that? It's like to have someone actually feel seen is like such a gift. And some people are doing it all the time. They and some people are getting it all the time. You're just like hanging out, giving all these great insights, but like that's not like that's a little God realm bubble, you know. So I think that's really beautiful, that something in you is like, let that be a gift.
Yeah,
you give your gift.
Yep. Yeah. I've had to sort of, to some extent, give myself permission to just let that be a thing and be like, oh, this is what's happening. So because it wasn't like someone sat me down and was like, okay, this is what you are and who you are and whatever, but it's like, oh, this seems to be what's happening, so here we go. Yeah. Well, it's been so lovely to talk to you, friend. I think these kinds of territories and experiences are so precious to me, and to have someone to make sense of them with and hear your experiences with them is so nourishing for me. So thank you for taking the time and also for sharing it with the world. I really appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, thank you. This was really, really nice. I appreciate it.